Hello and welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have Alastair Greener join me on the show today. Alastair and I met each other at the Business Book Awards recently, and Alastair has been shortlisted in his category. So congratulations, Alastair. Your book, Generationally Speaking, really excited to see that go through to the next round.
Yeah, thank you very much, Victoria. It was really quite a thrill, to be honest with you, and the sort of feedback I've had from the book has been very positive. But to be recognised for it is a nice little cherry on top of the icing, really.
Fantastic. Well, as soon as you shared with me what you talk about, the work that you do about helping people to navigate all the things that come up with working in the workplace with so many different generations, I knew I had to have you on the podcast, as this is a topic we've definitely not talked about before. So, what I would love to do is just open up with a broad question around who are these different generations? All these terms get bandied about, get talked about. So, could you just give us a bit of an overview so we've got a common understanding before we jump into the detail?
Yeah, and that's really important because a lot of people, I just assume everyone knows because I know, and you forget that people don't. So actually, there are 8 generations alive today in
Eight.
2026.
Wow.
Now, the youngest generation was only born last year. So that's Generation Alpha. I said Generation Beta, I should say. They were born last year in 2025. Now, I should also say that these sort of cut-off points, it's not like all of a sudden something changes, all of a sudden they're new. It's far more of a moving feast. But a generation is really where they are framed by something that happens around their upbringing. So things are changing all the time, whether it be technology, whether it's social norms, what's happening in the world. Key elements of history will define a generation. And because we're changing so much, those generations are actually getting shorter. So traditionally, we think of a generation being great grandmother, grandmother, mother, daughter, and so on. But actually, it's more to do with what's happening during a lifetime. So the current generations are probably only about 12, 14 years, where earlier generations were sort of like 26, 25 years, because the world wasn't moving at such a pace it is today. So we've got Generation Beta, just born last year. Then we have Generation Alpha. Now, they were born between 2012 and 2024, so just 12 years. This is what I nicknamed the AI generation because they are going to have AI as part of their world, especially the younger Gen Alphas. Even the oldest, who are 14 in 2026, even them, by the time they get into the workplace and they start studying, AI is going to be very much a part of it. Then you have Gen Z or Gen Z, depending on where you live in the world. They were actually nicknamed as Zoomers, and they were also nicknamed as iGen for some peculiar reason. They were born between 1997 and 2011. So the oldest is now 29, the youngest 15. This was the first generation where they were digital natives. They grew up with social media, they grew up with technology as part of their lives. They don't know a world without mobile phones, without that level of technology. Then you go to Gen Y, or better known as Millennials. They were born between 1981 and 1986, aged at the moment between 30 and 45. This was, I think, is a really significant generation because this was the generation who were born, the kids of the baby boomers. And baby boomers wanted their children to be brought up different to themselves. They wanted to give them a voice. They wanted them to be heard. And that had a significant impact in the way that they then presented later on. They're known as being very collaborative, and they are a generation who wants to be seen. Then we get Gen X, 1965 to 1980. Today, 46 to 61. The nickname for them are the latchkey kids. These were the kids where parents, for the first time, both parents were probably working, and the kids were saying, off you go, come back at tea time and, do what you want. What that did was create a very resilient, very creative, and very strong generation. However, the slight challenge with that is they don't have the same empathy when it comes to younger generations who don't necessarily have that same level of resilience, if you like. Then we have the baby boomers, 1946, 1964. They're between 62 and 80. So most of them are pretty well left the workplace by now. And I'll come back to the workplace in a moment. But the baby boomers born just after the Second World War, and there was a physical baby boom, but it was more in America where that happened. So this is the generation who were actually the biggest movers and shakers of their time. You know, Gen Z say, oh, we're changing the world, everything's happening. Actually, you look back at what the baby boomers did. You know, they were born to parents who were living through the war. And this was a whole new generation of people who saw the world very differently. So then there was the silent generation. They're 81 to 98 today. So they were the post-First World War generation. And then we have a few people of the greatest generation who are 99 plus. Not many over 125, which is the top end. So those are the generations. And we often hear there are 5 generations in the workplace. There aren't. There are 4, but actually it's 3.5, because most boomers have left the workplace by now, and actually only half of Gen Z are in the workplace right now. So the dominant generations in the workforce right now are Gen X and millennials, and particularly millennials are the ones who are really steering the workforce and the workplace and workplace culture. And that's been the shift. So they have now become that sandwich generation between the emerging generation and then the older generation who tend to be the C-suite. So there you go.
Brilliant. I love that. Thank you so much for that explanation, because I know I, in myself, get very confused by all the terminology. And it's actually really helpful that you're helping us to challenge some of the myths that are out there, because I do hear this fact of 5 generations in the workplace, but actually there is that kind of reality. The majority of the generations are really sitting, as you say, with 3. So we've kind of now got that defined. Let's bring this into the lens of the workplace. You know, in the work that you do, and I also know that you've done a lot of research around this as part of your book, but I'm really curious about what you see as the biggest challenges in the workplace today, generationally speaking.
Well, first of all, what I should say, which I should have mentioned before, is put a little bit of a caveat. One of the objectives of my book was to look for patterns rather than relying on stereotypes. And I think that I heard politicians mention recently, we live in an absolutist world where everyone wants it to be, it's this. So Gen Z are just like this. Boomers are just like this. The reality is it's a lot more nuanced than that. And one of the things I wanted to find out in my book was, at what point do we actually adhere to those patterns of our generation, and at what point is actually, no, that's the stereotype that doesn't really exist. The challenge is, yes, we have more generations in the workplace, a greater span of generations in the workplace, but there's a big difference in the way that they think. And the generation that the generation we become, really depends on our upbringing. I use a model called the 5 circles of generational influence. What that model does is say, okay, so who are you? Who are you, Victoria? And the first of all will be the generation, the world you grew up in, what was happening in the world when you grew up. Then you drill it down to, well, each country. If you were born in Poland, or you're born in Australia or Malaysia or America, your upbringing would have been different. Less so for Gen Zs, actually. They're more connected and they know of each other's cultures and differences more now than maybe certainly when I was growing up. But you then drill it all the way down. So in the UK, if you were born in the 80s, a very different experience in the north or the south. All of that frames who we become. And let's be entirely honest, if you have twin siblings, they don't behave exactly the same. So we just have to put a little bit of a caveat in that. And that is actually one of the problems, is there is this stereotype. There's almost this sort of, prejudice against certain generations because of what people think. We've heard so many times the snowflake, for Generation Z, which is completely unhelpful. And what you have to do is understand the world that they grew up in, which was very different to those of us who were older, and that dynamic change. So as a result, the workplace has to respond. It's always had to respond.
Mm.
And then you've got the third aspect, which is the stage of life that we go through. Isn't it interesting? Whenever we go to the workplace, none of us wanted to be told what to do. None of us wanted to, be strictly governed in the way things were. That's an age thing. That's a life stage thing, not a generational thing. And I do love that millennials have forgotten what they were like when they joined the workplace. And millennials, I've got a little bit of a wake up call for you. You weren't that much different. you
Mm.
know um, so all of this coming together, you've got at the other end of the spectrum people leaving the workplace, but actually a lot of people have a huge amount to give still. Yes, there are one or two people in the workforce who, frankly, it's probably is time to retire. You're ready, but there's others who are incredibly creative. They're incredibly, they've got a lot to give still. So you've got all of that happening in one workplace.
I love that. And I think it's really what I was just thinking and reflecting on. You talked about the word stereotype, and that's actually really important in this conversation, right? Because we can get into a space where we want to fit people in boxes and almost be like, well, that is the box you sit in, that's a label you have. But I also know in my work, which is more broadly about culture, being culturally intelligent is recognizing the person in front of you and who they are and what shaped them. So I love your lenses that you looked at that. So you talked about 5 lenses, just to double check that I got them all. So you had the world that you were born in, is that right? The culture, where you were born, the context, which I think is incredibly important. I'm now going to misremember what comes next. What are the next ones then?
So you start off with the world as a whole, the generation.
Mm.
Then it's where in the world you were born, so internationally. Then nationally, within the UK, where were you born? And then the next one down from that is, were you urban? Were you rural in your upbringing? Very different. I live in a small village, and very near me is a conurbation of about 210,000 people. The upbringing is going to be quite different. Then you drill down to, well, what about your friendship group? Who are the people around you? Who are your parents' friendship groups? How are they interacting with you? And then you get right down to the real basics of what's happening in the home. So all of those things, and then you combine that with your stage of life that you're at. And then also the other elements to always remember is social evolution. What's happening? How are we doing? We encourage conversations today. I was brought up a generation you were seen and not heard. It was a complete opposite. And that flipped around about 1980, when the boomers started having children. They encouraged those conversations. So Xers and boomers shouldn't be surprised that younger people are coming into the workforce asking questions, challenging. That doesn't mean they're being negative. It's just they were brought up to do that.
I love that. And I thank you so much for kind of also taking us through like the rest of the model, helping us to understand the different levels within that, but also to recognize like some of those challenges that might be coming up. So let's come to the specific question of communication, because this is sometimes the thing that comes up, right? People expressing frustrations around, well, they never do this or they always do this. There's absolutist statements, as you mentioned. So when it comes to communication, what are some of the things that you notice in your work with organizations, with teams, that we need to be mindful of when thinking about cross-generational cohesion?
When I set out with this project, the first thing I wanted, it was something I was very interested in, but I needed to know, well, actually, is this really a problem? So the first survey I did in 2023, we interviewed 110 HR professionals to try and get a picture of what was happening in the workplace. I'll be honest, I was hoping, yeah, we've got real friction. We need you to solve our problem. Actually, very little friction. But what was really interesting was 66% of HR professionals said that if communication between generations was better, that would make a marked difference to the productivity and efficiency of their organization. So, in a sense, that made me realize, you know what, you've got a bigger problem than you realize, but because people aren't fighting in the corridors, you're not maybe dealing with it. So when it comes to communication, you're absolutely right. And actually, I think you were probably implying also expectations as well, which are very different. And communicating expectations on both sides is incredibly important. And again, I have a few key things that I recommend to my clients when we're talking about bridging that generation gap in the workforce. The first one is making sure that your recruitment is transparent. You're being completely honest with your recruitment, and so that when people arrive at the workforce, what they get is what they expect. We've heard a lot about Gen Z expect integrity. They expect you to live by your word, and if you've promised them something, that's what they expect. Why? Because that's what they've experienced all the way through their lives. So that's what they expect. And one of the biggest challenges a lot of organizations have is the gap between recruitment and onboarding. So Gen Z particularly, we're talking about Gen Z more because they're the ones coming into the workforce. That's where the friction is probably more. There is some friction at the other end, which we can come to later, but Gen Z is probably the biggest focus, and it's where most of the questions I get come from. So when it comes to recruitment and onboarding, making sure that they are in sync. A lot of organizations, they are completely different work functions within the organization, especially if you go into public sector, if you go into large organizations, and they're not always talking to each other very clearly. So getting those two working together really well is important. And then the onboarding, spending time. And a lot of people think, I remember my first job, I got a pad and paper, off you go, take some notes and come and ask any questions. That's not going to wash today. Think about how they've been brought up. Think about the way that they've been parented. We have parents who bluntly over-parent, and they over-give and over-solve problems. Well, if you don't create an environment where people coming into your organization can effectively what's the word I'm trying to, so there can be a transition between being at school, university, into the workplace. And yes, at work, you're going to have to do that. And that comes down to the way that you communicate, understanding them. And of course, within communication, making sure that you use words they understand, making sure that you use context. I heard someone in a school I was at recently said, talk to A-level students about the Generation Game. That was a show that came off air in the 90s. What on earth are you talking about stuff that they don't get?
Yeah. And I really like how you've mentioned that. But this is going to sound like a really basic question, but also, how do you know what you don't know? So how do you know what words or language or things are going to land and what is not with Gen Z? So I'm really curious to kind of get your perspective on this. This may sound like a very simple question, but it may be something that listeners are asking themselves.
And you're absolutely right. I think a lot of it is context. I think one of the funny things that always amuses me when Gen X talk about this young generation, they forget they're your kids. So how do you talk to your kids? What language are they using? What cultural references? Now, nobody wants what I call generational appropriation. They don't want you to be like them, but they do want you to understand. So the simple thing is ask questions. So I use a model where it's a 5-step plan if you want to engage with other generations a bit better. First one is be interested. Then, ask questions. Then listen, and really listen. I love the quote that says listening isn't just waiting for your turn to speak. So actually what they call authentic listening. Once you've done that, then don't judge. That's when we all judge, and the young judge just as much as the older, but don't judge. Just take the thing. And if there was somebody on my podcast who came on who gave me a great quote. She said, if you find yourself about to make a judgment, just ask another question. Ask a clarifying question, and that will help you to not go down that judgment route. Then don't compare. I think we've all done it, haven't we? Well, when I get old, I'm not going to say, well, back in my day. It doesn't help, and it just becomes a little bit patronising. There's a time and a place for that where it's interesting, but not not in the workplace every day. And then once you've not compared, then you just actually have to accept they are different. Their world is different. The way they do things is different. And just accept it. Don't become like them, but try to seek to understand. So ask questions, really.
I love that. And I think for me, it always starts with curiosity, trying to understand where other people are coming from, having the empathy to kind of try and connect with what's going on for them. But also, I love that idea of acceptance, because ultimately you can spend a lot of and waste a lot of energy complaining or moaning or being frustrated by it, but it doesn't help. It doesn't move things forward. So let's imagine we're in a team, we're helping a team, and they do have this, they've started to do this process, they started to understand each other. What comes after that? I mean, is this about establishing new team norms or new ways of working, or what happens as that next step, really?
That's a really good question, because it's actually a natural evolution. It was really interesting. I was at an event with Deloitte recently, and they have a manual of me. And a manual of me is basically helping us to understand who each other are. So what are our communication styles? Do I want a WhatsApp? Do I want an email? And that will be generational, because yes, we know that chances are older people will probably prefer emails. Younger people probably will go to instant messaging on whichever platform they like to use. So finding out that way and then using that. So I talk about omni-channel communication. And it's using all of it. Now, I know it's hard work, but you probably have the same thing as I do. In the morning, you turn on your computer, check, where do you check for your messages? First, your emails, then your WhatsApps, then your texts, then your LinkedIn messages, then your social media messages. And I'm sure you've probably done exactly the same as me, saying, I had this conversation with someone, where was it? And I appreciate it's hard work, and it's harder than it's ever been before. But if you want to truly engage and continue that relationship, then do that. There's a really interesting fallacy about Gen Z, that they don't want to communicate, that they'll only do it through text. That's just plain not true. They are seeking relationships because they've had relationships with people in a very different way that previous generations have. And actually, they love that relationship. They love you showing an interest in them. They love the fact that they see it as a bit of a partnership as you progress through the workplace. So forming that relationship and taking that time to understand them and checking in with them. Oh, how's the house move going? Oh, you went to Ibiza. Tell me all about it. They want to share, and they want to do that. And actually they are quite happy talking. Quick thing about the phone. Do they talk on the phone? No. Why? Because they haven't had to. I was growing up in a world where that was the only way you could have a conversation with someone who wasn't in the same room as you, unless you were going to write a letter. So a friend of mine, Anthony Steers, who calls himself the telephone assassin, who is also a podcast guest of mine, he talks about the younger generation are actually happy to use the phone, but they just need to be shown, because it's not part of their natural way of doing things. So if you help and guide all the way through and invest that time, it will be paid back.
And what's playing in my mind listening to you talk about this is I absolutely agree with you with this idea of omni-channel. We do have to be very fluent and able to and agile, I suppose, very quickly move from one channel to another. But where does conversation come into this? I mean, you sort of slightly refer to it in terms of the telephone, but connection, conversation, maybe some people might even call it small talk. Where does that belong in this kind of idea of connecting across generations?
I think it is absolutely essential. And the interesting thing is the young want to talk just as much as anybody else, as long as they feel comfortable in the environment that they're in. And funny enough, I've been talking to a few of my clients recently, and one showed me their brand new office they've just moved into. And I'm going to be working with them in Reading in a couple of months' time. And what they've done is they've created an environment, because everyone is talking about, do we bring them back to work? And we know that Gen Z want that flexibility and everything else. The reality is that Gen Z wants to be in the office, because they don't want to be sat on the stairs and things doing their emails, because that's the only place that they can do it. So they do generally want to become in the office. They want flexibility. So it's about creating that environment in the office where they want to be there. One of the challenges is they get to the office, then they're on Zoom calls because their millennial bosses are at home, because for them it's easier because they've got childcare. Again, sweeping statements, but this is what's often happening. So if workplaces are creating an environment, so one particular office that I went into and worked with them was amazing. They created a giant U-shaped kitchen where inside the U was where you made your coffee, you got stuff out the fridge for lunch, and you did all that stuff. On the outside of the U were people sat on stools. Guess what they were doing? Conversing, getting relationships. Think about how many people 20, 30 years ago met their future life partner at work. So we're doing the younger generations a huge disservice by not creating an environment where they can. Now, I'm not in favour of mandating people back to work, but if you can encourage it, and then you get what I call learning by osmosis. People listen to conversations. Gen Z might not want to be told what to do, but they want to listen. They want to learn. That water cooler training, as I call it, is massively valuable. And yes, they do want those conversations. We just have to create the right environment. And that environment isn't a horrid little kitchen down a corridor somewhere where people are looking, oh, we spent a bit too much time in the kitchen. Anything that brings people together and get that connection is absolutely fundamental to who we are as humans.
I really like the idea of the design of that particular office that you were describing there. And it brings to mind something that I feel is very important, being intentional to create conversations, designing conversations, thinking about where does this conversation happen? It doesn't have to happen in a meeting room, right? So it's very interesting. You've been observing this as well. And interestingly, yeah, talking about the social dynamics, workplaces are not just about a place to do work. They're also about the social context. And I remember myself learning so much from not just listening to conversations, but also observing behaviors, like watching what were people doing in the meeting room, just watching the body language and understanding how people responded to each other. So I think I absolutely agree with you. There's something really interesting there. I'm really curious. I mean, Alastair, I appreciate this is a huge topic, and there is so much in it, from generationally inclusive language and policies to kind of how to communicate and work better together. But where do you see it going? I appreciate you've done a huge amount of research in this field, but how do you think it's evolving, and what's going to be coming up next that people who maybe were listening to this podcast who are already established in their careers, perhaps some of those Generation Xers and millennials, what do they need to be mindful of going forward?
I use a phrase about change, and change needs to be evolution, otherwise you get revolution. So what I encourage organizations to do is continually change, but change a little bit incrementally all the way. And then you don't get that sort of resistance. Because it is changing. I wish I had a crystal ball, know what's coming. We know that the biggest disruptor in the workplace at the moment is AI, and that's having a huge impact on graduate jobs and how we're all going to be working, especially in the office environment. And I defer to other experts in AI in terms of how that's really going to impact. But what that is creating is a lot of uncertainty for young people, because they've had a constant, and in fact, there's already been some research that Gen Xers and Boomers are far more accepting of AI and far more able to cope with the changing workplace than younger generations, because they haven't seen that massive shift. Gen Xers and older millennials were there when the internet came along and the huge revolution that created. We're now in another one. And it will evolve. People said the printing press would put the end to conversation. It's always happened. The Industrial Revolution would put everybody out of work. It's just a permanent shift. So I would always encourage any organization to look at what's happening, embrace the trends, not to the point where you're going to put in every shiny new thing that emerges, but just being aware of what's happening so that you are carried along with that tide of change rather than suddenly, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And then, of course, there's massive upset within your organization because you're having to institute massive change.
And if there's one action, one thing that you'd be recommending people do. So let's assuming we're kind of again talking about people who are, in sort of middle to senior management, they've got opportunities to influence what could happen, to make a difference from a generational point of view. Where to start? Where is that kind of first place to make the move?
It's what you said earlier on, and I mentioned as well. We both agreed on, which was be curious. Be curious. If you're genuinely, authentically curious about every generation, everybody in the workplace, then you will have a greater understanding and a greater acceptance of who they are. And then when the challenges come along, you'll have a greater understanding of what's taking place. And one of the things which we didn't get to is what I call tangle your teams. Create we tend to be generationally siloed. It's nothing new. We like to be around people like us, whether that's culturally, whether that's age, that's just what humans do. So by shaking that up a little bit, by creating teams that have different generations within those teams, then you're going to get those natural conversations. Things like, if you've got a meeting, tell people you can't bring your phones in the meeting. And then people turn up to the meeting and say, oh, now what happens? You're going to have to talk to people. You're going to have a conversation. What did you get up to over the weekend? And when you start having that better connection, that's when you get better engagement. That's when you're going to get less attrition, and you're going to have a more inclusive and happier workforce, which isn't just a nice thing to have. It makes massive economic sense.
Absolutely. Well, Alastair, thank you so much for sharing these insights today. I found this conversation fascinating. I know I've learned a lot from this, and it's certainly massive food for thought and definitely more to kind of reflect on. What are the best ways for people to learn more about your work, about your book, and so on? Would you like to just share a little bit about that?
Certainly. First of all, there is my book, which I just happen to have by me. There it is. So my book actually does two things. It, first of all, helps people understand the generations. And I think that's the starting point of all of this. So it's a real manual of how to understand all the generations. And then there's some science behind it in terms of the research I did of 4,000 people to try and understand how do people like to communicate today, and then some tips in business. So I've got my book. There's also my podcast, which is called Alastair Greener, Generationally Speaking. We're up to episode 37, 38, I think now. And again, I have three sets of people on there. I have people who either defy the stereotype, because I hate stereotyping, or they're people who have skin in the game. So maybe HR professionals, maybe lecturers at university. What are they seeing with generations? And then also people who are somehow involved in generational communication like me. And I've had from a 15-year-old who set up his own political party all the way up to a 92-year-old who still runs his own commercial property business. And of course, just connect with me on LinkedIn. Just look up Alastair Greener. The good thing is there's only one of me, so you'll find me easily. And all the links are there to everything that I do. And I'd love to have the conversation with anybody who would like to find out how we can bridge that generation gap in the workplace.
Well, very, very important work that you are doing. We will, of course, put all those links in the show notes. But Alastair, thank you so much for this very illuminating, insightful conversation. I have found it fascinating. It's also shifted me to think about things differently, not only for the workplace, but also with my own children, I have to say, who are in those kind of upcoming generations. But thank you so much for joining us here today, and also for your time.
Thank you, Victoria. And yes, I'll get you on my podcast soon as well. So thank you for
Lovely.
inviting me.
Thank you so much, and very much look forward to seeing everyone on the podcast next time.